Oh, you still?
Okay.
And then I should just keep admitting people too, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for joining Effective Dog Behavior to introduce Dr. Arri Eisen, epigenetics research. I want to do a quick land acknowledgement. I'm on I forgot the name. Waput land. And you'll see the No More Stolen Sisters in my background. So yeah, thank you all for joining, where we get to actually discuss somebody from the outside the dog training industry to help us understand a little bit more of the science of epigenetics and what it actually means and stuff like that. And we got to meet Arri up in La Vida. Was it La Vida in Colorado, Diana?
Both. You met Arri in La Vida and in Walsenburg. I only met him in Walsenburg.
Yeah, so that was in a small place in Colorado, which is really cool. It's funny where you meet people. And thanks to Sandra for introducing us too. Can't forget that. She's pretty amazing. But yeah, I don't have any formal introductions outside of that. So Arri, if you want to just go ahead and do your thing, because that was quite mesmerizing last time.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Diana, for having me. Yeah, what I thought I would do is just introduce a few ideas just for 15 or 20 minutes, talk about this kind of revolutionary science of epigenetics, and just do that through a handful of stories. So I'm only going to show 6 slides, and I'm only going to talk for a few minutes. And then y'all, I'm more interested in what y'all have questions about based on what I ask and your own experiences. So I'm going to share my screen just for a few slides, and then I'll stop sharing and we can talk more directly, hopefully. So let's see. Need to find this. Looking for something to share, but
And like Arri said, you're more than welcome to post comments, questions, are more than happy. We'll just do them, at the end.
Yeah, you could pose questions while I'm talking, but we'll spend a lot of time, as much time as you want after the first 15, 20 minutes. So this is my little introduction here. So it's about this new field of epigenetics, which is kind of the hyphen in nature and nurture. So I'm not a dog guy other than owning dogs, but pretty much everything I'm talking about is definitely relevant to all mammals and probably all organisms. So I'm just going to tell a handful of very short stories. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned from working with some Buddhist monks, teaching them science. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we first started thinking about epigenetics in a new way. I'm going to talk about an experiment a friend of mine called Brian Diaz did that kind of made us think about how this new way might work. Talk very briefly about, we already knew some of this stuff, kind of, and then what we didn't know, and then why this might matter. So first of all, this is my friend Lobsang Dongdup, and you might wonder what a Buddhist monk has to do with me or with anything else, but for the last 15 years, I've been working actually with the Dalai Lama and his Buddhist monks and nuns in exile, because he invited us in. He invited a bunch of Emory professors and now professors from all over the world. He invited us to teach his monks and nuns in exile in India science. So I've been doing that, and one of the first times I was there in India, I thought I was a pretty good teacher by then. I'd already been teaching for 20 years and thought I knew what I was doing. And I was walking through the foothills of the Himalayas where the Tibetans are in exile with this guy here, Lobsang Dongdup. And I asked him, why are you studying science when you're a monk? Why aren't you off doing monk stuff? And he said, well, he spoke English, so a couple of the monks spoke English. He said, well, first of all, is that the Dalai Lama said it was a good idea, which is a good answer if you're a Buddhist monk. And then he said, I'm studying modern science so I can understand my Buddhism better. So I can become a better Buddhist. I'm studying modern science so I can become a better Buddhist. So that kind of pulled me up short. And it was kind of an epiphany for me as an educator, because what I realized Don Dupe was saying was, it just made me rethink what I was doing as an educator, because what he was telling me was, look, you're not going to change who I am, but you can give me some wisdom that can help me become a better version of who I already am. So ever since then, I've really changed the way I think about teaching, and it's relevant to today because I don't know how many people are in the room, maybe 10 or 15. So that's almost 700 years of experience right there. So I'm really not going to talk very much, because I'm going to inspire and catalyze some ideas, hopefully, in you. And then I want to hear from your experience. I want to hear your questions and engage you. And that's kind of what I was always striving towards. But after I had this conversation with this young man, it made me realize that even more. So basically, I don't talk much anymore when I teach, and it's mostly driven by the audience or the students, which is what I'll do today. Let's see, it's not. Let's see if this. So here's a weird thing that happened just in our lifetimes, even in my students' lifetimes. There, a couple of weird discoveries were made that kind of shook the world a little bit. This guy on your left, or my left anyway, is named Marcus Pembry. He's a British guy, and he was studying, along with some Swedish colleagues, he was studying this group of people up near the Arctic Circle in Sweden. This group of people were kind of a scientist's dream, because they were very isolated, a geneticist's dream, because they were very isolated. And they were all the same religion, and they had the same culture. In other words, they were kind of a control experiment going on. And they kept very careful records of who was born when, who the parents were, who died, what they died from, when there was a good crop, when there was a bad crop. It was almost like perfect. Probably about 20 years ago, this guy was studying this population, and he was deep in the archives, and he made this startling observation that he told Marcus Pembry about this guy here. And that was that if your grandmother or your grandfather had been through a famine in this town, because they knew when the famines occurred and they knew when people were born. So that means they kind of knew the life history of everybody in this town. If it so happened that your grandmother or grandfather had been alive at a particular time in their life during the famine, it was much more likely that you had a metabolic disease like diabetes or something like that. Very striking correlation. Now this was kind of strange, because from everything we knew about what's inherited at the time, we knew that we inherit our genes. You inherit your genes from your grandparents and from your parents. You know that, half your genes from mom, half your genes from dad. But genes take generations and generations to mutate and adapt. Here was a case where it seemed like experiences people had just a generation or two ago affected the diseases that people were getting. So that was really weird. Okay, so keep that in mind. Then this woman here, Rachel Yehuda, she's a psychiatrist, and she started noticing something equally weird that turned out to be related. So she was seeing patients that were coming to her, young people that were coming to her with post-traumatic stress, which is sadly not unusual. But the unusual thing was they hadn't suffered any traumatic stuff themselves. But their grandparents had been through the Holocaust. But they were showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, which again, the genes can't change that fast, suggesting that something was being passed on. So she just assumed it must be that the grandparents were telling their awful experiences to their grandkids, and that somehow got traumatized them, because you could imagine that happening. Well, it turns out that in several cases, these people never knew their grandparents were even in the Holocaust, much less what happened to them. You can imagine why, you know, people would hide that kind of thing or suppress it. They never even told their grandkids who had this post-traumatic stress that they were in the Holocaust. So again, this kind of traumatic thing, in one case of famine, which has to do with if you don't have food, you don't have energy, you suffer, it affects your body. How would that affect your grandkids, and what food, and whether they had food or not, and how they responded to food? Or in another case, the awful traumas of the Holocaust, how would those affect your grandkids? It can't be the genes, because the genes are the same, haven't changed in such a short time. So it's got to be something else, something above the genes. Thus the term epigenetics. People started thinking, this sounds weird, it doesn't fit into anything we understand, but there must be something else going on here. This is my friend Brian Diaz, who was at Emory, where I work here in Atlanta, where I am now, for many years. Now he's out working with children in trauma out in California. Brian had this brilliant idea to kind of test the ideas that Marcus Pembry and Rachel Yehuda, I just showed you. Could you test them? Now, you can't do that in humans. It's not ethical to test these ideas in humans. But Brian had the idea of testing mice, because mice are mammals too, and they've only been separated from us 4 million years or so, which isn't that much in evolutionary time. And he had this brilliant idea, because a lot is known about mice and their genetics, and you can do all kinds of fancy experiments with mice that not everybody, like my Buddhist friends, for example, they would never do experiments on mice, but most people in the United States are comfortable enough doing experiments on mice. And Brian's idea didn't hurt the mice at all. He simply did the following thing to test. Still more people coming in, so I'm just admitting that. Brian wanted to test this idea that more could be passed on, that something that happened to me could be passed
Some
on.
water out of a pool,
So
obviously.
somebody's got to mute themselves.
But it's the winds, you know, and the trees around us that concern me.
I think I can mute them. I'm muting.
Okay.
everybody. Don't take it personally if I'm muting you. Okay, so Brian did this thing. So what he did was he took male mice, young male mice, and he did the classic kind of Pavlovian training with them with a smell of a particular chemical that he knew a lot about. He knew how this chemical worked, and he knew which neurons it interacted with and how it affected the brain. This had been known for a long time. And every time he gave those male mice that chemical smell, he gave them a little foot shock. It doesn't hurt the mice, but it causes them to give a startle response. They just kind of have this experience. And after a while, after you do that with the mice a few times, this was known for a long time, all you have to do is give them the smell and they have the response, even without the shock. They act like they've been shocked. You with me? So it's a classic entrainment thing that I'm sure as dog people you're familiar with. Well, now is when he got creative. So the next thing Brian did was he let these males mate with female mice who had never experienced any of this stuff. They hadn't experienced the smell, no foot shocks, no nothing. So they didn't know anything about that. They mate with these fathers that had been trained with the smell and the shock. And then he took the male pups from that mating and exposed them to that smell again. What happened? They froze, as if they'd been shocked. And if he took those pups and mated them to other naive females, and then took the grand pups and exposed them to the smell, they froze. So these are pups that had never experienced this smell before, much less the entrainment. But the experience that their father or grandfather mouse had affected them. So here was what Rachel Yehuda and Marcus Pembry had seen, or something very analogous had seen in humans. And now he was seeing it in mice, but now he had a very controlled environment where he could look at the mice. And sure enough, not only were these mice carrying the memory of the experience of their father or grandfather, because the genes were all identical. The genes never changed in any of these mice. All the mice are genetically identical, or genetically, unless they're male or female, of course, and they're a little bit different. So he had a system to find out what was being passed on epigenetically above the genes. So he checked all the genes, no gene changes. So it had to be epigenetics. It took him 2 or 3 years to publish this. Diana and I were just talking about how hard it is to publish anything. But if you're trying to publish something that goes against all the paradigms that are out there, it's even harder. So the reviewers kept making him repeat things because they made him take the mice into different buildings. They didn't believe this was possible, that you could pass on this sensitivity to an experience. But since then, so that was 2017, maybe 2018. Since then, once it got published, it's been repeated. And now we have a way of understanding like what happened, what was passed on above the genes. Obviously the genes themselves were passed on. And you do all the controlled experiments with, and you show that it's only the mice whose father or grandfather or now great grandfather had this experience. Do they act that way even without the shock? They act as if they've been shocked when they get the smell. Pretty cool. So we can talk about what we've discovered since then about how it works. And we know some things and we don't know other things. But now Brian and many other people around the world have shown that this is indeed happening, that there are ways that the genes themselves can be marked so that they kind of piggyback information, and you carry those marks into the sperm and the egg and then are born with them. And then other ways of carrying those memories have indeed shown to be true. That's epigenetics. Well, it turns out we kind of knew about epigenetics all along. We knew there must be something above the genes all along, and you knew it too. Even if you don't know any biology, you've observed what I'm about to say. But one thing is identical twins. We've all known identical twins. Well, what are identical twins? They're two people, or it could be triplets or what have you, that are genetically identical by definition. But if you've ever known identical twins, as they get older, now when they're young, hardly anybody can tell them apart except for their mom and their best friends. But with time, they become very different. And this is a gentleman, Peter Zalewski, just somebody I found online that was taking some photographs of identical twins. And here he is trying to show that even if you dress up identical twins, which often their mothers and fathers will, to make them look identical, they're not. Right? So these two girls, the younger girls, they have every one of their cells has essentially exactly the same genes, not only within one person, but also between the two sisters. Right? And then we see some older twins on the right, and you can tell if one of them cut their hair and they were wearing different clothes, you may not even realize they were twins. They're making an effort to look identical, but look, they're not identical. And as people get older, as twins get older, they look more and more different, even though they have identical genes. So there we see epigenetics right away. Why? Because people experience different things. There's no way you can experience the same thing, even if you grow up in the same house. Emotions, illnesses, what you eat, what you like, who you talk to, who your friends are, people are different, even with the same genes. So that was epigenetics. And you're each one of you is a walking case of epigenetics, because if you look at my cell here in my cheek and my cell in my ear and my cell in my eye, they all have identical DNA. They have exactly the same DNA, but obviously they're different, and they're using the genes differently in my ear, in my eye, in my cheek, hopefully, right? They're doing totally different things. So not only are they using the same genes to do totally different things, they're not the same genes, but each cell has the same genes and is using different genes to do different things. But every time they divide, they remember. Think about that. When this cheek cell divides, even though it has the capacity to be any kind of cell in my body because it has all my genes, it always remembers to be a cheek cell and to make two cheek cells. That's a kind of epigenetics. That's a memory that you have that you all have. So we kind of knew epigenetics was happening. What we didn't know is that it could happen across generations, so-called transgenerational epigenetics. And that was the cool part that Brian and Marcus Pembry and Rachel Yehuda and now many other people have looked at. So what we don't know, as usual, is much, much more than what we do know. How does experience lead to a memory getting marked on your genes and then passed on to your kids? Do all experiences get passed on, or do they have to be traumatic or special, or what? And how exactly is it passed on? I mean, we know that the only thing you pass on is sperm from dad and egg from mom, and they get together. That's it. It's got to be in there. So how does that happen? And how long does it go on for? Seems like some of these traits go on for 3, 4, 5, even 6 generations. Some of these sensitivities to experience can be passed on for that long. And then, of course, and maybe most exciting is, and we could talk about all these things, why does this happen? Right? Why did this evolve? Because things don't just evolve magically. They evolve to give you or your children an advantage, right? And then what's maybe most exciting about it is that it's clearly flexible and adaptable, because until something happens to you, it doesn't change you and it doesn't get passed on. And then it goes away. So unlike the genes themselves, which never really change essentially, except over many generations, here's a very flexible mechanism. That means we can intervene, we can change it. And that's probably what happens when, say, somebody gets therapy for PTSD. It is what happens, sorry. We've done the experiments, and you can look at people that have certain epigenetic marks, and when they get therapy or take certain medications, or even better, both, those marks go away. So that's exciting. So this is a much more flexible and maybe, for lack of a better term, usable mechanism for therapies. So a lot of questions. Hopefully you guys have a lot of questions. This is my doggy Zeke in Colorado. He's pondering the universe, trying to figure out epigenetics. So now I will stop sharing and just take questions from you guys in the chat. Hopefully I've sparked a few questions.
So I got one. You said, but you didn't get to explain, why is it good? Why would those markers be good for the next generation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And you know, in typical Western fashion, we usually discover Western science usually discovers what happens normally by studying things that happen abnormally. It's just kind of the way our system works, for better or worse. So the 2 cases I brought up were a famine and a Holocaust. So the last thing you would want is to inherit sensitivity to those. Maybe. But think about this. Think about if you're in Ukraine right now, and unfortunately you happen to be pregnant, and the war started. Well, if you're in a war environment, you actually want your kid to have what we call PTSD outside the war environment. We only call it PTSD because there's no war going on. But if you're at war, or if your kid is going to be born to war, you want somebody that's hyperactive, hyper aware, ready for action, like this, right? So the idea is that it's a quick way to tell your kid what's coming, right? So that's the idea. If you're experiencing a famine and you're about to have a kid, or you have kids, you want them to be able to survive off of much less food. You want their metabolism to be set off of much less food. Now, if the kid is born, or the grandkid is born, and the famine's over, but they're sensitized to act as if they're in a famine, you can get diabetes. So it looks like a disease, but it's probably a way that evolution has come up with a way to have your kids survive right away, much quicker than changing genes, which takes a long time. So here's something you could do in a generation. And it should freak you out a little bit, right? Because you might have thought, well, I can do what I want. All I'm going to pass on to my kids is my DNA. Well, now it turns out that there's a lot that you can do to yourself that you have a choice about. Obviously, you don't have a choice if you're at war or taken prisoner during war. But how about things you do to yourself, like if you become an addict, if you smoke, things where you have more of a choice. Now it seems that those kind of stressful things could potentially be affecting the next generations more than just you. Here's a question from Diana. Someone who could not attend wanted us to bring up epigenetics of intergenerational trauma, kind of like we're talking about now. White researchers love to discuss ethno-racial groups are more prone to punitive measures with their children and even their pets, but they never discuss the violence white people inherit from being colonizers and imperialists. So, I mean, I'm not going to comment on races or trauma or anything like that, but clearly trauma impacts people. We knew that, that's obvious. The new piece is that in impacting future parents or grandparents, you're probably also impacting their offspring. You're giving them, you're passing on a memory of sensitivity to something that happened to you, or your grandparents are passing that on to you. That's very different than passing on a trait. Don't get confused, right? You're not passing on PTSD. You're not passing on smoking addiction. You don't, it's not like a gene. It's a sensitivity to an experience that you're passing on. It's very, very different, even though it sounds the same. Let me give you an example.
Oh,
I can never become addicted to cigarettes if I never smoke one. No matter how sensitive I am to becoming a smoking addict, if I never smoke, I can't become an addict, right? That's just one simple piece of the puzzle. Then, of course, you are unique. So yes, my grandfather lived through the Holocaust, but we don't know exactly what happened to him. We don't know what happened epigenetically to him. We don't know what he passed on. And then there's been a whole other half the story, 3/4 of the story from my grandma, right? And then from my parents, and then all the things that happened to them. Plus all the genes I got, which are now a unique combination of all 4 of those people, or actually more than 4, 8 of those people. So it's very, very complicated. So making, it's very tempting to say, you know, this is epigenetics, or pointing to epigenetics in political and racial conversations. You just have to be super, super careful for obvious social reasons, but also for scientific reasons about overextending what we're talking about here. Okay, so that's as much as I'll say about that. Kimberly's saying, I teach genetics and biotechnology at a Jewish high school in Maryland. I have a small epigenetics unit. We cover Norbotten. I'm not sure what Norbotten is. Would you be available to Zoom with high school students? Of course. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to anybody anywhere about this stuff, because it's so important and fascinating.
I've got another question. See if I can phrase it. It keeps popping in and out of my head. So there's always that phrase or saying that I have an addictive personality. Like, is that more epigenetics, or is that genetic, or is that, because I remember, because I'm also feeding off the back of when we were in La Vida, somebody brought up that, well, you were talking about the addictions for cigarettes. If it wasn't cigarettes, I'd be addicted to this, or I'd be addicted to this, or I'd be addicted to something else.
Yeah, so just a couple of things while I'm thinking of, I just posted in the chat 3 references for those of you who want to get into this a lot more. The first 2 are much better. The third one is me talking about epigenetics in a different way. But there's two really good books that address Scott's question and a lot of your questions that I recommend. She Has Her Mother's Lap by Carl Zimmer, and there's a chapter in Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Gene, An Intimate History. Actually, that chapter is also in the New Yorker. So if you just search the New Yorker and Mukherjee, you can find that. If you're interested in more of the details of epigenetics. And then to Scott's question, what's an addictive personality? I mean, again, it would probably be a piece of the puzzle. But I think epigenetics explains a lot of the following. So once genes were discovered and we sequenced the human genome, we're talking 1980s up until early 90s, people thought originally that if we sequenced Scott's genome, we would know all about him. But it just turned out to be a phone book, right? So I don't know if you guys remember phone books, but you used to get this book and it had everybody's name and number in the city of Colorado Springs. So 300,000 names and numbers. Just information. It didn't tell you anything about who the person and their phone number was. And it turns out DNA is more or less the same. So if I got the sequence of Scott's DNA, yeah, I could say a few things. He probably has a certain hair color and eye color, but nothing really useful, which is really interesting.
Wow.
But suggests, and I'm overstating a little bit, but suggests that epigenetics, the stuff that is marked onto Scott's DNA, the stuff that he does and experiences, the stuff that his parents did, is what makes the difference with those genes, which then turn out in a phenotype, like we saw with the identical twins becoming very, very different people. So an addictive personality, yes, there might, so what people did for a long time was look for the addiction gene, or they looked for the love gene, or this gene or that gene. And then they said they took a bunch of people that were alcoholics and they looked at all their genes, and a bunch of other people from their family say that weren't alcoholics and looked for all these genes, and they looked for the alcoholism gene. We're going to find the alcoholism gene. Nope, never worked. You would find in this family, you would find some interesting differences between the alcoholics and genetically, but then that gene would be totally different in another experiment. And nobody could find the alcoholism gene. Why? It's so complicated. There's so many different genes involved. And everybody has different experiences and does different things with their genes. So I don't know if I answered anything, Scott, but
No, it did. It made a little bit more sense.
yeah, it's a complicated thing. Yeah. One last thing I would say is, well, why does addiction run in families? Why is this, or why does depression run in families? Again, it's probably genetics and epigenetics, right? Because if you grew up in a family of 2 alcoholics, well, you're going to be super stressed. You're going to be exposed to alcohol all the time. So if you're getting genetic input from those 2 parents and epigenetic input and environmental input, well, nobody would be too surprised if you too became an alcoholic. But maybe it's just as likely that you reject all that and you never touch alcohol because you see what it does to you. So it's complicated. Diana says, I came across a section in your book where you mentioned that when mouse mothers take good care of their pups. So another thing that seems to be epigenetic that Diana's talking about might be in the same way that Scott was asking about addiction. There are all these studies done on these poor kids, say in Romanian orphanages, that were never touched. So they never developed. So there's another case of having all the genes, but if you don't have the supportive environment, if you don't have the mother or the community or the touch, in this case, physical touch, you don't even develop. I mean, you don't even grow up. Your body doesn't even grow. So that's probably an epigenetic phenomenon. And all the genes are there for being quite a normal person, but you don't get the environmental stimulation. And then Diana asks, can this gene be turned on at a later stage in the pup's life when this care does become available, or is that window closed? Whew, good question. Yeah, it probably depends on a lot of things. I ran across some recent discoveries about, I'm teaching a course on sex and gender, the biology of sex and gender. And there's some pretty powerful evidence now that men and women, humans, and probably other mammals, can essentially be a mother or a father, depending, as if we have the kind of blueprint to be mom or dad, but culture and situation, and for example, in our culture, make it much more likely that mom is going to do certain things. But if mom's not there, for example, and we see this in other primates like gorillas and orangutans, and I'm sure you've seen it in humans, then dad can become a pretty good mom. It's almost, and you can actually look at that biochemically and genetically, that he's almost like biologically a mom. And even in rare cases, men can lactate, which sounds ridiculous, but there's been recorded cases of men lactating. And that's a bit extreme. But the point is that the genetic basis for a lot of things seems to be there. How to access that, and that's your question, Diana, like when can that be accessed, and is it certain windows? I don't know in particular cases, but it sounds like in the case of the parenting blueprint, the mother blueprint or the father blueprint, that it can be activated at different times. Like we all, all through history, there are women whose whole job was to nurse kids that weren't theirs, for example. And they start lactating and they become mothers, and it's not even their kid. It's not even going to be their kid. It's just their job to nurse them. We've seen women take on male roles and become very aggressive and basically do anything that needs to be done to save their kid, kill other animals, things like that. So my guess is that those things can be activated at different times because, again, the DNA hasn't changed. Oh, here's a question from Mary that I missed. I'm sorry, Mary. I'm an educator and I work with neurodiverse people. Could epigenetics play a role in people's neurodiversity? Yes. Epigenetics probably plays a role in everything. I don't want to overstate the case, but remember that nothing can happen. All you've got is your genes and your cells. So that's all that can be acted on for anything to happen in you. It doesn't rule out God, or it doesn't rule out anything, but if God's going to act through you, or if somebody else is going to act through you, or any relationship or anything you eat or anything, it only has your genes and your cells to go through. And the genes and the cells don't really change. What changes is when what the environment is, quote, telling those genes to do. So like I'm kind of keeping myself hydrated by eating this orange, right? So as soon as I start eating it, my genes don't change at all, but which genes are on to digest the orange are change. And then when I'm done digesting it, those genes are turned off. It sounds simplistic, but for neurodiversity, let's just take one example like autism or something, an extreme example, not to stereotype or anything. But we know that many autistic kids, again, when you look for the autism gene, there isn't one. A lot of times. Of course, autism is caused by many different things, as you know better than I do, probably, Mary, but you can't find an autism gene. Why? Well, it's not the genes, it's what's acting on the genes. Autism may be caused, in some cases we know is caused by the presence of certain bacteria in the gut, or certain diets, or totally weird things. Autism can be caused by many different things. Point is, it's all environmental. And there might be certain genes or experiences those genes have had when they were in your mom or your granddad, so to speak, that make you more susceptible to becoming autistic. But more often than not, Mary, it's how the environment, a particular environment, acted on those genes. You had an infection when you were inside mom before you were born. You didn't get a certain kind of bacteria in your gut that you might normally get, that kind of thing. Let's see, a new message from Janet. I'm going to mute you, Mary, just to be rude. There was an earlier question, behavioral Lamarckism. It sounds as if this is analogous to behavioral Lamarckism. Yeah, so Lamarck, I'm not sure what the question is exactly, but Lamarck, who was laughed out of the room, in centuries past, turns out to maybe have had something, right? Because Lamarck was the guy that said the way traits are passed on is by, say, mama giraffe. When mama giraffe reaches higher up in the tree and extends her neck because she's reaching higher in the tree, her kids are going to have a longer neck. And then Darwin and everybody just kind of laughed him out of the room. But now it turns out that maybe Lamarck kind of had a point, right? Maybe that, at least conceptually, maybe the experiences, the things that you do, the things that you choose, or the things that happen to you could affect your offspring in ways that we didn't appreciate until now. And your offspring's offspring. Yes. You guys aren't asking any questions about doggies. Does all this relate to dogs? What do you think?
I'm working on it. It's just all so fascinating and so different, because I think a lot of the times we see stuff in the dog training world, we talk about, so like here's a primal case, or here's a commonality in the dog training world. If we have an aggressive dog or a dog that training can't fix, we say it's genetics fault. Or maybe that's the way the parents were, and so now the dog is going to be. Yeah, so like there's, unfortunately, I don't like bringing in a dog training divide, but if they say if you can't use R+ with a dog, then it must be a genetic problem. If you try to fix the dog because of medication, and of course that's subjective depending on what the dog's actual showing, what behaviors you think you need to work on. But if the dog's done it too many times and people go, well, it's just aggressive, it must have been the genetics. Maybe the mother was aggressive and passed that trait down onto the child. Pup.
Yeah, it's really
I
hard
know
to
there's
separate.
people that breed for stuff like that, but not to that extent where they're going to snap on certain things.
Yeah, it's
Does that
really
make
hard.
sense?
It's hard to separate genetics and epigenetics, right?
Yes.
You almost have to do it experimentally, but I think you and I talked about the paper that came out recently that was talking about breeds. I think it was in Science last few months ago, that breeds are, it's really the individual dogs that are different, and it's not the breed so much, suggesting that it's not genetics, but more epigenetics, suggesting, and I don't know enough about dogs, and these kind of experiments, so to speak, need to be done, but suggesting that it's flexible, right? That it's more, that's not written in the genes, but that therapy, if you want to call it that, in a dog, or dog training, I guess you could call it, would be effective regardless, but it would have to be the right kind, right? And that's what's only recently been effective therapies. I'm not an expert in this area, but effective therapies for PTSD and things like that are really just during my lifetime. Have really just come about from my lifetime. Initially, it was just called shell shock, and the soldiers were just told, it was initially identified, what we now call PTSD was initially identified in World War II soldiers, and they were just like, it's all in your head. Go on, just go on, get over it. It'll be okay. That was the initial therapy. And then it's only with the Vietnam War that it was officially recognized as more of a diagnosable thing. And then only since then and now there are actually therapies that help the soldiers get better, or help other people with PTSD from other traumas get better. And what's changing is their epigenetics through what we call therapy in humans and what we call training in dogs.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in on that one real quick, because that question gets me a little further. Just, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just because something is genetic doesn't mean that the genes are going to be expressed in that way.
Exactly.
So because the gene expression, as you said, we all have the genes already available, but how they are being expressed is up to the environment. Is that not correct? I mean, certain genes will be expressed. For example, we are humans, that genetically we are different than mice, physically, and so on. So certain things will be expressed in a specific way, in a specific time frame and developmental stage. But when it comes, especially comes to behaviors and so on, just because you have a genetic predisposition doesn't mean that those genes are going to be expressed in that way. And the reason why I'm asking is because there are even puppies, whole litters that are euthanized because of a fear that they might turn aggressive, that they might turn on their humans, even though they are little puppies and they're exploring through play, and sometimes that play gets rough, and it can get rough. But just because they are playing that way, and that play actually teaches them not to be rough when they turn out to be adults, when they mature more. So that's what play is supposed to do. But just because the genes are there and the puppies are playing rough doesn't mean those genes are being expressed in that way when they grow up. Am I wrong in that?
Yeah, you're generally correct. Generally correct. It should be, if someone's claiming that this dog should be put down because of a certain genetic signature, then that should be determinable. You should be able to, it's not just a feeling or something. It should be something you could point to, and it would be testable. And there might be cases like that. I don't know enough. There's a few, there are a few cases, like when I was talking about Scott in the phone book, there's a few things you can tell from the genes. But yeah, you're generally correct. So my guess would be that almost everything would come down to environmental exposure of those genes, and therefore how they were expressed. But if there were X plus Y plus Z genes, and every animal, every organism that has those shows this behavior, which is unlikely but possible, then that should be measurable. You should be able to take all those pups, take one of their pieces of fur, and check and see if they have X plus Y plus Z. That's a very measurable, easily now inexpensive thing you could do before anyone could make a claim that we should just kill. You should be able to do that.
So I also think that it's more of a cultural thing too that's being implemented on the dogs, on how dogs should be acting.
Sure.
Versus actually like what the dog's genetic makeup might actually be. Like that study we were talking about, how one of the things I found totally fascinating was the training bias. And it was, if it looks like a German Shepherd, treat it like a German Shepherd.
Right.
But you have a Chihuahua that acts pretty much the same way as a German Shepherd, but you don't take it seriously because it's a Chihuahua, even though it's doing the exact same type of protection, quote unquote, protection type behaviors.
Yeah.
That a German Shepherd you want to train for, but you're not going to use the Chihuahua for protection because it's too adorable.
one of the most powerful drivers, environmental drivers, is culture. Not just for dogs, but for humans, for gender, for race, for, you know, the way others in your environment act towards you is a big part of your environment, and that's what culture is, for better or worse. So yeah, for sure. Let's see, Mary says, generally the things I've learned working with individuals with autism and other differences seem to be true of dogs and other non-human animals. Yeah, certainly for mammals. And at the molecular level, most of the stuff we're talking about seems to happen all the way down to bacteria. So billions of years ago. And of course, it makes sense, right? Because all organisms have survived because they have learned to adapt to the environment. And you just don't have time to change your genes. And changing your genes is way too expensive and costly, unless the environmental change we're talking about has been around for generations. So of course, epigenetics has been there since the beginning. And probably when we're talking about mammals, very, very similar mechanisms, and evolution doesn't waste time. Once it finds something that works, it keeps it. So if it was found to work in bacteria and it's still working now, then we're all using very similar mechanisms for the same processes of memory. It's just a way to remember, right? And memory is so key to everything, to learning, to what you do, to what you don't do. Let's take one more question. Anybody out there that hasn't had a chance to ask us, see, is epigenetics the foundation of evolution? That's from Diana. Anybody that hasn't had a chance to ask questions, like to ask a question? Yeah, like I was just hinting at, epigenetics can take care of things in the short run. It's probably why it evolved for the next generation, maybe the next 2 generations. But Diana asked a good question. Is epigenetics the foundation of evolution, or a foundation of evolution? Because you would think if something stuck around long enough in the environment, you would just want to keep it and not have to worry about changing it off or on, and that's what genes do. So yes, there must be, and people are studying this now, trying to figure out how it works, but at some point, what is epigenetic must become genetic, right? So yes, epigenetics is probably, I would imagine, some kind of interim, quick changing thing to respond to the environment. But if that environment continues to be stressful in a certain way, my guess is there must be some I'm 90% sure there's crosstalk between epigenetic memory and genetic memory, because that would only make sense. At some point, if that stressor is in the environment over and over and over again, continually for generations, we know that there's a selection for genetic changes so that the genes do change, although it takes a long time. So we're still figuring that out, Diana, but I wouldn't be surprised. Well, I enjoyed talking to you all. I encourage you to check out those 3 books, or at least 2 of the books that I mentioned, if this stuff interests you. And then I'm sure by now there's I know there's a growing literature in dogs and animals and epigenetics. One of the most fascinating ones is taming. If you think about taming an animal, what we call taming, it's got to be epigenetic. I mean, you're not changing the animal's genes that you found. We found our dog just running around in the mountains, for example, and now he's tame, whatever that means. But there's a fascinating literature and writing on what happens quickly in epigenetics. What happens epigenetically really quickly, amazingly quickly, when an animal is tamed. I think the first papers are in foxes that they tamed, but it's the same thing in dogs. It happens dramatically quickly. Why? Probably, oh, this dude's giving me food. He's taking care of me. He's keeping me warm. He's giving me everything I need. Why would I do what I was doing before, there's a dramatic shift in genes and gene expression. I'm going to be nice to this guy. You know, I used to think these guys were dangerous because I didn't know, I was afraid, but now I'm getting all my, whatever I need from this guy. I don't know why, but it's working. That's all an epigenetic change. The dog's genes didn't change when we found him. He's got the exact same genes. Your genes can't change within one organism. But the expression of those genes and his emotions or whatever dogs have that's equivalent is what changed. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to read out there. And everybody is saying thank you and thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Arri, Dr. Arri.
Thank you, Arri. Thanks for everybody to join.
Yes, thanks everybody to join. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, and we'll keep in touch, Scott and Diana, and let me know what else. And there was a couple of folks that are teachers or wanted me, so you'll provide them with my contact information, right?
Yes,
Okay.
we can do that.
All right,
You
cool.
want to turn the recording off?
Oh yeah, I'll do that. Stop recording.